Have a great episode for you today with an actual photo sent in from a listener. Let's get right to it. Dear Donovan, for years I'd been tightly clamped inside the mysterious gears of a government job at an undisclosed facility. If I painted you this picture of being a cold, cool Secret Service agent, think again. The reality, quite frankly, was much starker. Number crunching, paperwork, and year-round flu, complete with sneezes and coughs. I'm not here to bore you with the file pushing, coffee brewing, and mundane environment of working a job that's never revealed. I have quite the extraordinary tale to share that crept into my life a few years ago, a time when I thought naughty noodles was as weird as it gets. How wrong I was. You know, there are reasons you keep something hush-hush. A surprise party, a special proposal, or even a top-secret government facility, holding what we would say are, well, foreign matters. And when you stumble on something that rattles your beliefs and shakes up your reality, it's hard not to pry. My story begins in the monotonous labyrinth of the facility, around 5 years back. We always had underground bunkers, levels that even had clearance level names so hush-hush that it was practically espionage to speak about them out loud. As an analyst, I wasn't typically involved in the physically covert aspects, content with my mind-boggling data sets, and report deadlines. One day, we had an unexpected system shutdown, and I was assigned to assist with the maintenance team. My job was to keep track of what files and records were recovered, confirming their order, and reinstating the system models, and a load of way above my pay-grade tech jargon. It was somewhere in that nerve-wracking process that I accidentally accessed a file I wasn't meant to, finding a picture that was well beyond what I expected. In it, shrouded in a kind of strange mist, stood a peculiar creature, a being of about 4 to 6 feet tall, captured in its full glory, even though nestled in the foggy background. At first, I dismissed it as a prank, a manipulated picture designed to mess up with the rookie. There was something so captivating about it, yet unnerving in a weird way. It was an interesting mix of shadows and mystery that looked unlike anything I'd seen before. Its eyes, they were hypnotic, so dark that they just seemed to consume you. I noticed that the area they documented had a high voltage mark, as if whatever they held was something quite dangerous, or should I say, electrically unusual. I was not sure what to believe, yet there was a nagging feeling that made me push through my fears and press further onto this cloak and dagger situation. Little did I know, I was about to uncover something that would not only shift my perception of life, but send it spiraling down an enigma of intergalactic proportions. To be honest, Donovan, I hadn't seen the half of it. I could barely breathe, barely contain the sudden realization. Was this foreign matters, an alien matter? The thought clung to my mind, unraveling like a spool of thread as I stared at this absurd, yet chilling image. As ludicrous as it seemed, all roads led to this extraterrestrial explanation. What other explanation could there be? As my heart pounded in my chest, I knew I was stumbling onto something that was not meant for my eyes. Perhaps my understanding. Hesitant yet drawn by an inexplicable urge and curiosity, I downloaded the image onto a flash drive I always carried with me, sweat accumulating on my forehead, my hands shaking as if that single file weighed a ton. In the realm of bureaucratic routines and mind-numbing work, this was a shock. The existence of extraterrestrials was something from TV shows, books, and far-out theories, not our everyday life. But staring at the image, I was thrown into the deep end of this uncharted universe of secrets, an unsettling perspective that would have sent any ardent disbeliever into a corner to question everything they knew. Securing the picture was a leap of faith in the unknown kingdom of dread. What if they found out? What if this secret was too big to be overlooked? I was an average Joe in a suit unfit to unveil intergalactic lies. But then again, what was I supposed to do? The truth was right before me. Post-downloading the image, I managed to return to the monotony of my job, but my mind remained a whirlwind, the alien picture embedded deep in my thoughts. Days turned into weeks, but I could hardly sleep, barely eat, and my concentration dwindled down to nothing. I would often catch myself staring blankly at the coffee machine, lost in the realms of what ifs. Could I go public about the photograph and its implications? Would anyone believe me? Or would I be labeled and discarded as another nut job? In the end, I accepted that the truth was stranger than fiction. I admitted to myself that those black, haunting eyes were not from this world. Aliens were real and among us, drenched in the government's secrets, and hiding right beneath our uncertain noses. A realization that awakened me, and I was no longer the same person. I walked the path of a believer, yet the only evidence I held was a single image. An image of undeniable evidence that shattered my normality and replaced it with an ever-present, unsettling truth. I then made a decision to step out of the shadow of that daunting revelation. Here I am, Donovan, telling you, ready to walk the labyrinth of conspiracies, government cover-ups, and the vast eccentric universe that is dancing right under our oblivious eyes. I was ready for the world that was tuned into your show, ready to spill the truth, an unearthing of cosmic proportions, and shake the foundations of our realities. That would be all for now, Donovan. That's my story of an unsuspecting encounter with an alien existence that forever changed my life. Thank you for the opportunity to share my truth. I've got a pretty wild story to share with you. I'm a police officer and was patrolling down near the border of Arizona and Mexico. It was a pretty quiet area, but the desert can be more than creepy after dark. The moon was out that night, I remember that. It was a particularly lonely stretch of desert road, and the light of the moon didn't do much to make it any more inviting. The desert comes alive at night, but the shadows are hiding spots for the nocturnal creatures. I wouldn't say I was afraid of the dark, but I can say that I don't like surprises. These border patrol assignments can get pretty monotonous. You have way too much time on your hands, and you start to think about things. It can be a dark, boring, lonely meander through the dirt, dust, rocks, and cacti. More clock watching than anything else. It's normally a pretty routine job. That night, though, something seemed off. You know that feeling at the back of your neck, like something or someone is watching you. A kind of buzz in the silence of the desert, or a chill in the air that signals that something just isn't quite right. It was that kind of feeling, and I couldn't shake it. It was just past midnight and I spotted something. It was an unusual figure darting across the landscape like some startled animal, but bigger than anything I felt comfortable with. It was bigger than any damn coyote or mountain lion I've ever seen in this area. I couldn't make out exactly what I was seeing from that distance, but there was a sense of wrongness about it. Like whatever it wasn't supposed to be here. All my senses were on high alert then. This definitely wasn't part of the job. I tried catching up with the figure, having that reflexive urge to apprehend an illegal border crosser. Rookie mistake. I found myself rushing into the unknown after this mysterious figure. The adrenaline was pumping through my veins, and my unease was building. I wasn't sure if I was hoping it would be an animal or a person. I really didn't want to have an encounter with anything larger than a fox, but the creature I had just seen was definitely something more impressive than that. What I found, or rather what found me, didn't resemble any animal I've ever known, and to this day I can't fully explain it. It finally stopped running from me and turned around. It was like it had decided it was done running, and that it would challenge me instead. The night was quiet, as if it were waiting for an oncoming fight. Despite not being able to make heads nor tails of the situation, I braced for a confrontation. My hand was on my radio in case I needed to call for help if necessary. The wind blew through the towering cacti, and the lonely hills gave off an eerie whisper. The landscape around me began to close in, the shadows stretching out against the moonlit sand, and I just knew I was not dealing with an illegal border crosser here. The figure, now brought into sharp focus by my flashlight, made me take a step back in shock and horror. For instead of a fear-stricken human face, what met my gaze was a fierce creature out of a science fiction nightmare, standing at an incredible height, rivaling my own 6-foot stance, and peering at me with cold, slitted eyes was what I can only describe as a dinosaur. It was a humanoid, or so it seemed, with a lizard-like head filled with sharp teeth. Its eyes glowed yellow against the beam of my flashlight. Its gaze held intelligence and cunning, but it was the teeth that I was focused on. If this thing tried to attack me, I knew I wouldn't stand a chance. Its body was a grotesque display of heavy-plated scales. They shimmered, almost glowed under the moonlight. If the creature itself wasn't so terrifying, I would say it was almost beautiful in a way. The moment seemed to stretch on forever as we locked gazes, a part of my mind stuttering in total denial, while the practical part was readying to radio and backup. The creature, meanwhile, was holding a device. Something shone brightly in the moonlight, but its purpose or intent I could not fathom. I tried to move, my fingers instinctively twitching towards my holster, but I was frozen. I still don't know if it was fear or some other inexplicable force that held me back, but just as abruptly as it had appeared, with a slight adjustment to the strange device in its hand, it vanished. What followed was a still silence. The chilling encounter left me rooted at the spot, for God knows how long as my mind grappled with the reality of what just happened. Later, driving back to the outpost, alone in the patrol vehicle, the desert outside more alien than before, I had a tough choice to make whether to report the incident or not. In the end, I didn't. Who would believe such a story? Even I was questioning my sanity. But as the days rolled into weeks and months, instead of fading into a distant memory, this encounter was something I found myself coming back to, again and again, its reality still raw and vivid. So now I'm sharing it here. What I saw was real. I don't know what it was or where it came from, or maybe more importantly, where it went. The creature was clearly intelligent. I don't want to come right out and say, I think it was from another planet, but where else could it have gone? Maybe someone else out there has an idea. Or maybe one of you have seen one of these things out in the desert after dark. It was just another morning in Plainfield, Iowa, in the spring of last year. Waking up before dawn has always been a part of this way of life. Or maybe it's just the habit. The difference is, as a farmer, your clock is the rooster crowing in the distance, signaling the start of a new day of work. Out here, miles away from the nearest neighbor, we take pride in being stewards of the land. My family's been maintaining this Iowa farmland for generations. We've got about 200 acres of corn on the farm. It's a tough job, but it keeps us busy. That morning, I remembered an eerie calm wash over the fields. You know when you just sense that something's out of place? A thick, early morning fog made it hard to see the fields in detail, but even through the fog, I could tell something was wrong. The fog lifted and the sun rose, and I headed out to the fields. Rows of green corn stalks lay flattened, intricately spiraling out from a central point like a dizzying maze. I'd seen crop circles on the news before and pegged them as pranks by people with nothing better to do. But this was different. Now, I'm not a man who leaps to conclusions. I've learned not to do that on the farm. But I couldn't explain how anyone could have achieved such an intricate design overnight, and without me hearing a thing. Hell, we don't even have fancy drones in this part of the state. Not that any local prankster would have the money for one. The crop circles got me thinking. It wasn't about the lost harvest, but more about the mystery itself. I guess the farmer in me saw a problem to investigate, not a paranormal mystery, but a pest problem with an unusually creative approach. I decided on setting up some surveillance around the farm. I didn't even tell my wife. She would have thought that I had lost my marbles. I had my old hunting stuff lying around, including a night vision trail camera I used to track wildlife during deer season. I dusted off the old thing and set it up on the edge of one of the fields near the crop circles. As day turned into night, I settled in the den, my eyes fixed upon the grainy feed coming from the camera. Every motion sensor blip, every rustle of the wind, heightened my anticipation. As the tall silhouette of the cornfield swayed ominously under the gray shroud of the night, my eyes struggled to adjust to the grainy black and white feed. Sometime around midnight, I saw a figure. It was barely visible from a distance. A wiry figure emerged from the rows, moving with an ethereal grace. It was skinny, with a head too big for its frame and features that were humanoid but grotesquely stretched out. The night vision camera didn't pick up color, so I didn't know if it had that famous alien gray skin. All I knew was that it stood with an uncanny lanky silhouette against the backdrop of my cornfield. The figure stood still for a few moments, looking towards my house with those big, black, oval eyes. I held my breath. My blood ran cold, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I struggled to wrap my mind around what was happening. I know what it looked like, but it was like my mind didn't want to believe it. The creature walked around the flattened corn stalks and looked to the sky. Maybe it had friends around, I don't know. But as it was scanning the area, it noticed the camera. It looked right into. It was like it was staring right through me. I knew that it couldn't see me, but it felt like it could. I was terrified. And then, just like that, it was gone. The creature disappeared right into thin air, as if it had never been there. The sudden stillness of the field was almost as terrifying as the encounter itself. As I sat there, my mind raced. What was it doing there? And how did it recognize the camera? I didn't know. All I knew was that during the course of one night, my world turned upside down. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, just sat there in front of the camera feed as the adrenaline left my body and daybreak began to light up the room. The following days were filled with uneasy thoughts. I felt like I was straddling the line between two worlds. A part of me tied to the mundane practicality of running a farm, the other part in constant fear of the unknown entity that I had seen on the trail cam. I was plagued with thoughts. Was the creature alone? Would it come back? And why here? What did it want? Every creak of the house at night, every unintended movement in the dark, my mind twisted it into signs of the creature returning. Many nights later, I am still here watching the fields through my trail camera, just a simple farmer and an unlikely witness to the unknown. I wish I hadn't seen what I had seen, but now I can't stop thinking about it. I have more trail cams set up these days, hoping to catch them if they come back. Thus far, I've only caught images of deer and foxes wandering in the night. No signs our friends have returned. No crop circles. No nothing. I'm afraid I'll never know what the creature wanted or why it came to my field. I can only sit here and wonder. I've got a wild story from the time when I was working as a park ranger in Alaska. The wilderness there is almost indescribable. Just miles and miles of pristine beauty, completely untouched by man. The summer months are amazing, but when winter rolls around, it can get brutal. The cold there reaches inside you and touches your bones. At the time, I was working in this isolated station, which was a good 2-day trek from civilization. Such isolation can take its toll on some people, but I always found the solitude comforting. It was midwinter, and the entire landscape was veiled in a blanket of fresh snow. As stunning as it was, every creature had to work twice as hard for survival, including me. Part of my daily duties involved monitoring trap lines set up in the area. In addition to the cold, conquering the rugged terrain was just as merciless under all this snow. These traps were spread out across a good stretch, requiring me to traverse dense forests that teemed with all sorts of wild critters. Evidence of animal activity was quite frequent: claw marks on tree trunks, flattened shrubs, and even an occasional carcass here or there. It was the reality of wilderness, raw and unfiltered. I remember that morning like it was yesterday. It was absolutely frigid, and frost covered the windows of my truck. I set out on my usual route, but it wasn't long before things took a strange turn. I noticed certain irregularities that I ended up shrugging off as odd coincidences. When you get that far out in the woods, the lines between the rational and the irrational blur more often than you'd think, especially when you are dealing with extreme weather. But I carry on, eager to get back to the warmth of the station. I was halfway through my rounds when I stumbled upon a trap, which was not just sprung, but ripped to shreds. Most of these were bear traps. They are pretty damn sturdy contraptions. I had never seen anything like it before. The steel jaws were torn apart like they were made of paper. There were scratches on the ground and signs of struggle, but nothing that indicated the catch had freed itself. I did a quick survey of the area, and was suddenly hit by a putrid stench. It was the unmistakable scent of rotting meat, and it was growing more potent with each passing second. It was definitely rancid, and not something I would expect to find in a carcass at these temperatures. Anything long dead would be frozen out here. There was something else in the air too. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like the atmosphere suddenly felt heavy, oppressive even. Backing away from the unsettling stench and that strange feeling, I tried to regain my senses. As the day wore on, the nauseating aroma still hung in the background and seemed to get worse. You've smelled a carcass before, sure, but this was distinctly quite vile. It was akin to death and decay, being stewed over a slow fire. Now, I'm not one to scare easily, but I can tell you that the woods felt off that day. The usual rustling of leaves was subdued, the common calls and melodious chirping eerily absent, as though every creature was holding its breath. The tall trees cast long, dark shadows that seemed to be hiding things far more sinister. I trudged through the heavy snow. The crunch of my boots was the only sound defying the silence. I felt an uneasiness creep up my spine. Something felt very, very wrong. The raw wilderness that I had come to appreciate over my years of service suddenly seemed menacing, but I pressed on. I wanted to get this job done as quick as possible, so I could get back to the station. As I continued, I began noticing anomalous claw marks on the trees around me, and strange tracks. They were twisted hoof-like prints mixed with the semblance of a human foot. I've seen deer tracks and bear tracks, but nothing like this. It was way bigger than anything I was familiar with. Strange sounds filled the air, so incoherent yet deeply unsettling. Every rustle of leaves and snapping of twigs started painting horrifying images in my head. I tried chalking it up to my own fear and overactive imagination, but then I began experiencing this sense of being watched. From the corner of my eye, I started seeing distorted glimpses of movements in the trees. I stood frozen for a moment, fighting the urge to flee. I knew I was dealing with something beyond my understanding. It was an ancient evil that I thought lived only in near-forgotten folktales. My fear argued furiously with my sense of duty, and the former won. I decided the best course of action would be to report these findings and return to the station. I didn't need to see the creature to know what made those tracks wasn't natural. It wasn't any creature I had encountered before in my line of work. This was something else. The forest wasn't the same. It felt like a hollow echo chamber for my fears, feeding on my insecurity and amplifying it back at me. I had heard enough old stories to know what makes hooves tracks and smells of rotten flesh. I won't say the name, but I'm sure you can figure it out. The folk around here claim that speaking the word aloud calls it to you. I still work out there in the wild, and I don't want any trouble with this thing. Never ever in my life have I felt such an overpowering sense of dread as I did that day. That encounter and the lingering uncertainty altered my perception of the pristine Alaskan wilderness forever. But remember, if you ever find yourself alone in the Alaskan wilderness, make sure you keep your wits about you. And if you think something is watching you, I'm sorry to say, you're probably right. This was definitely one of the stranger summer adventures my buddies and I ever experienced. 4 years ago, around this same time of year, we formed a small, amateur spelunking group. We all grew up in the nooks and crannies of Nashville, Tennessee, and we all had an insatiable curiosity for the unknown. One weekend, armed with headlamps, ropes, and well-packed backpacks, we set out to explore an intriguing network of caves at the heart of Tennessee. Since none of us were too afraid of stuffy, enclosed spaces, caving had become sort of a tradition amongst us. To us, it was a journey into a different dimension almost. The endless tunnels and unexplored chambers kept us more than occupied. There was something unexplainable about being in the belly of the uninhabited earth. You were utterly disconnected from the rest of the world. We had been exploring for half the day when we found a secluded chamber, hidden away from the others like a forgotten section. From what we could see, it was scarred with what seemed like primitive cave paintings. Incredible, we all thought, as we observed the intricate faded art left there by someone long ago. What a find, we thought. It wasn't every day you came across something like that, even on explorations like this. As we moved deeper, my buddy Jeff, the most experienced of our lot, suggested we venture a bit further into the cave. Now, I want to emphasize here that we were all usually very cautious. We knew the risks of this hobby, especially when it came to squeezing in and out of tight, unexplored spaces, and we had our set of rules. However, that day, as if persuaded by Jeff's enthusiasm, we decided to bypass those rules. I think we'd all admit that sometimes our sense of adventure gets the best of us. That is what happened that day. Deeper into the shadows we ventured. We moved away from the fading traces of the ancient cave artistry. We bypassed craggy rock formations, crawled through some dangerously narrow spaces, and climbed up a steep and slippery rock face that we likely wouldn't have done on a normal day. But this day was anything but normal. I remember the strange feeling of being watched. I wasn't sure what it was all about at first. It was a peculiar sensation, a prickling at the back of my neck, the kind of feeling you get if something is watching you from some unseen spot. The cave was silent except for the occasional dripping of water echoing through the cave, like a strange rhythmic click. Although our headlamps lit our immediate surroundings, the darkness, it seemed, was somehow sentient. It watched and waited. The thought unnerved me. I tried to brush the feeling off as a case of the cave jitters, but it kept creeping back like a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Just when I thought things couldn't get any more unsettling, we stumbled upon an extremely tight passage. A passageway so small, it seemed more like climbing into the mouth of a beast than a part of a cave structure. But Jeff, ever the explorer, decided it was our only way forward. And so, one by one, pulling in deep breaths and sucking in our guts, we slipped into the maw of the darkness. It was at that juncture that things truly began to unravel. About halfway into the narrow passageway, the air around us started to feel different. It was heavier. Even the cave's peculiar smell began to change. The walls didn't just echo our soft footsteps and short breaths anymore, but also a strange, barely audible clicking sound. It felt like it was bouncing off the walls, coming from everywhere but nowhere at once. I brushed my hand against the damp cave wall and let out a low whistle. Does anyone feel that? Silence. A shared, strained silence told me we were all feeling it. I remember my heart pounding as the idea of an unseen presence loomed all around us. It felt unnerving, eerie even. Something about this doesn't feel right, Russ voiced out, mirroring my thoughts. His voice bounced off the cave walls. That's when we saw it. At first, it was just a movement in the shadows, too fast to track, like a blur across our headlamp beams. It was silent for a good long minute, but then came the clicking sound. It was louder now, chilling us to the core. Following our better instincts, we turned around to retreat. I was the last to exit the small passageway. As I looked back one last time, I saw something I'll never be able to forget. There in the darkness was a pale and gaunt, human-like creature, silently lurking in the shadows where we just were. It was on all fours, crouched in a way human bodies weren't meant to bend. Its head seemed too big for its body, and its face was disturbingly empty. All I could make out were two frighteningly large black eyes and a gaping mouth. By the time I slipped out of the narrow passage, sheer terror propelled me through the rest of the cave. We rushed to the entrance. We had all seen that thing. That night, we didn't speak about what happened. We went back to our ordinary lives, carrying an extraordinary secret. Looking back now, I still find myself hanging between the realms of fear and fascination. What was it that we stumbled upon that day? Was it the guardian of that ancient artwork, or something more sinister that had taken up residence deep in the caves? Although I yearn for answers, my survival instincts keep me away from that place. Whatever that thing was, I don't imagine I want to have a close encounter with it. I've never seen another creature like that since, but I have felt that uncanny feeling again once or twice. That feeling of being watched from somewhere in the darkness. I've learned my lesson. Whenever that feeling creeps up on me out in the wilderness, I turn tail and head back to the car. This unbelievable tale happened in my previous line of work as a Jersey cab driver. I was quite the night owl back then. I much preferred the witching hour over the craziness of rush hour traffic. I've picked up all sorts of interesting folks during those graveyard shifts. But one night, one fare, stands out from the rest. Late fall in New Jersey tends to have a certain chill in the air, no matter the actual temperature or the time of day. That night was a particularly cold one, with frost starting to lay on the edge of the car windows. Just after midnight, I was near a usually bustling part of town that was practically deserted at the time. My dispatcher directed me to a pickup. It was a lone guy waiting outside an old neighborhood bar that's definitely seen better days. The guy was unusual, you could tell that from a mile away. But that was part of the job sometimes. I was there to pick up people that needed a ride, whoever they may be. The man was tall, older, and was wearing a faded flannel and jeans. He was carrying nothing but a small bag that looked as ragged as him. He asked to be dropped at an address I wasn't familiar with at first, which is a rarity for me. I've covered practically every nook and cranny of Jersey throughout my time on the wheels. As he spoke the address, I realized it was over in the Pine Barrens, not a place you'd typically get a fare to, especially this late at night. The drive initially was quiet. The hum of the car engine was the only thing interrupting the silence. As we moved farther from the heart of the city, I watched as the urban jungle gave way to withering fields and patches of woodland stretching into the distance. Faint city lights in the rearview mirror were gradually replaced by the pitch-black darkness of the countryside. The passenger didn't say much during the ride. He just sat there, his gaze fixed outside the window, unblinking. The shift from the usually busy streets to the secluded Pine Barrens area magnified the eeriness of the night. Every crackle of the radio and chime from the meter seemed louder than usual. Blame it on my wild imagination, or the creepy stories I heard as a kid. But the solitude of the night coupled with the strange passenger was starting to make me uneasy. Just then, the cab lights flickered, and I thought I caught a strange smell. It was pungent, almost like sulfur. This was an eerie part of the world. The forests around us seemed unnaturally silent. But little did I know at that point that this was only the beginning of a long, unforgettable night. After dropping off the fare in a rundown farmhouse that was barely noticeable amongst the thick woodland, he just waved me off without a word. I saw the dim light inside the house flicker briefly and then die out. As I maneuvered my cab to make the return trip, I caught sight of something by the corner of my eye that made my heart stop. In a clearing by a pond, lit up by the glow of the full moon, I saw what I later came to identify as the infamous Jersey Devil. It was hunched over the water, its bat-like wings folded over its bizarre, terrifying body. The creature seemed to be about 5 feet tall, with hawked legs and scales covering most of its body. The body itself was in a form similar to that of a white-tailed deer, but that's where the similarities end. Its head was strangely similar to a goblin or a ghoul. The snout was long and twisted. The creature's eyes glowed red in the dark. The creature seemed fixated on its reflection in the pond. The overwhelming odor of sulfur filled the cab. It was so strong my eyes were watering. I was frozen where I sat, a primordial fear gluing me in my place. I blinked, half hoping the creature would be gone when I opened my eyes, but it stood there, unmoved. That's when I noticed the most terrifying feature. The creature had a skeletal exterior, somewhat disguised by its scales, with an exterior skull that was undeniably demonic. Finally, spurred by fear and the instinct to survive, I tried to start the cab to get the hell away from there. But, as if aware of my presence, the creature turned its monstrous head towards me. Gone was the distant gaze. Now, those glowing eyes were fixed on me. My cabbie instincts of always being on the move kicked in, and I turned the ignition again. Mercifully, the cab came back to life, the sound of the engine startling the creature. With one last look my way, the Jersey Devil spread its wings, unfurling them in all their horrifying glory, and lifted off, disappearing into the dark sky. I wasted no time and floored the gas pedal, the cab lurching forward, away from the pond and towards the familiarity of the city. Despite my terror, a sense of awe hung over me as I raced down the deserted highway. I had seen it, the Jersey Devil, the thing of urban legends and late-night radio shows. I'd shrugged off those tales as long as I can remember. But now, well, let's just say those solitary night drives took on a new depth. Sometimes I catch myself looking in the shadows for another glimpse of the creature, almost hoping to see it again, just for the reassurance that what I saw was real.